Now, as Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses into her family, she paid the mother to take care of the baby until the baby was weaned. We ask ourselves, well, how long was that? Generally, it was from 2 to 3 years. Some assume that maybe it was until he was 12 years old and coming into manhood, but we have no proof of that. So let's assume that it was 2 or 3 years. Then the mother takes him to Pharaoh, or Pharaoh's daughter, and he becomes her son. She legally adopts him into her family, and Moses becomes her son. Make sure you see that. The daughter of Pharaoh took him, and he became her son. That means he should be written about in Egyptian history. For this is the only daughter of Pharaoh, and his name is Moses, and it might be some preface or suffix to that name, so we don't really identify it, but he was in the house of Pharaoh. So what was it like to be in the house of Pharaoh? What would it be like for a child to be raised with Pharaoh? In one of the books that I'm using as my commentary, John Davis writes concerning this, and he gives us some information about a little boy or a little girl born and raised in Pharaoh's household. Listen to this. What kind of boyhood did Moses actually have? Fortunately, through archaeology and related studies, some light can be shed upon this period of silence. Children were generally carefree and played much the way children play today. They used sticks and stones and made objects of mud and bits of broken pottery. Among the more wealthy children, however, some toys were probably used. A few of these have survived, and they have been found through archaeological digs. Among these are tops, miniature weapons, and several elaborate mechanical toys. One of these was a row of dancing dwarves on a platform, and they were made to jog up and down by means of string. An expensive toy, this one, for some nobleman's son who probably left it lying around in the dust after 5 minutes and went back to his mud pies. It would be interesting to see if Moses had such toys in his day. But we go on. Swimming, horseback riding, hunting, playing with household pets would all be part of the experience of a young boy in Egypt. Something is even known of the hairstyles of the ancient Egyptians. The girls let their hair hang loose or braided it in pigtails, but the boys had an unusual coffer. The head was shaved except for one long lock on the side, which was braided. And you can see pictures on the walls of Egyptian monuments of this. The distinctive side lock is known from the reliefs, and it was actually found on a mummy of a boy of about 11 years old. Interesting. In Hebrews and in Acts chapter 7, we read more about Moses, and I challenge you to go to those passages and look at what it says, because it's amplifying our knowledge, because the Jews had much more knowledge than we do, and they were taught by their rabbis. Stephen is preaching in Acts chapter 7, and he gives us a lot of insights to Moses and his life. And one of those things that he gives us an insight of is, says he was knowledgeable in all the sciences of Egypt. That means he studied medicine, he studied science, he studied engineering, he studied languages. He probably knew at least 3 or more languages. He would have known Egyptian, he would have known how to write hieroglyphics, and Sumerian, and Hebrew. All of that was part of his education. As J. Vernon McGee says, Moses was raised in the college or the University of Cairo. Yes, he was in the best universities of the time, with the great scientists and all the rest. He was a very knowledgeable young man because he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now we have to ask ourselves, who was this Pharaoh's daughter? We have no absolute certainty of who she is, but in using the timeline that we have of the Exodus and knowing the time period of the pharaohs and knowing a little bit about them. We don't know everything, but we know a little bit about them from the pieces of archaeology that's been put together, through the mummies and the tombs that were found and the writing on the walls. We know a little bit about that culture, and we know somewhat of what was happening. There was a princess that I think is very important in this whole concept, who was an only daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose, Thutmose, Thutmose #1, Thutmose the first. She married her half-brother, who was half-brother of another secondary wife of Pharaoh, and they kind of grew up together. That one was, the boy was much younger, so she usurped the power and actually became the queen and then the Pharaoh of Egypt. She dressed like Pharaoh, she acted like Pharaoh, she ruled like Pharaoh. She made herself a co-regent with her father, which was unheard of. And then when he died, she assumed the power and the authority. She had one child, and that was an adopted son. And that child received all the information, all the education in Egypt, because she believed that it was her son that had the right to become the Pharaoh, not this half-brother of a secondary wife of her dad. And so she had the legal right to declare that he would be the next king. That brings some interesting factors into this story. Her name was Hatshepsut. And you can look her up, and we have lots of documents on our website that give you further information. It's not just my information, but information from secular sources as well as Christian sources of who this queen of Egypt was, who this Pharaoh was. Actually, we have her statues, and she wears a beard like a man, she dresses like the man. She's trying to propose to people that she is legally the Pharaoh, and she served. She was Pharaoh for 21 years, and then suddenly she disappears. She disappears from the historical line, and her little brother that grew up with her becomes the king. You can find that in these passages, because Pharaoh, who wanted to get rid of Moses, who wanted to kill him, was probably that secondary brother who came to power. Now, it's some interesting stories here of how this might work together. I want to refer you to a book that I have been reading. I don't swallow everything that's in it, but it's a wonderful book about the case for Exodus, and it gives us some helpful hints of who Hatshepsut might be in the who Hatshepsut might be. All of this is speculation, but it looks like that might have been the Pharaoh's daughter. If it was, that puts Moses into a very high position in the echelons of authority in the Egyptian empire. Now we remember in Hebrews chapter 11, I believe it's verse 24, that says he refused to be, when he became a man, about 40 years old, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I can imagine there was a conflict in the palace. This woman Pharaoh was trying to dominate everything and push her brother to the side, but she was trying to raise up Moses. And perhaps there was that time when someone becomes Pharaoh and the transfer of power is given to him, his name is changed, and he is given the name of one of the gods. And actually they believed he was a deity. And perhaps it was at that time that Moses had a conflict with his stepmother and said, I will not be called by a name of one of your hundreds of gods. I will not be called Thutmose. I will not be called Moses. I will not be called Moses. I am a child of God, and I am a child of the Hebrews, and I belong to the God who created the world. And he knows the name. At that time, Elohim, the God, creator God. An interesting story, and I leave you to your own speculations about that, because it's not proven, but it certainly looks like that would be an interesting part of the story if it were indeed the facts. Now we're at the section where Moses grows up. He's been in Pharaoh's household. He's 40 years old. Perhaps there was a conflict with his mother, but now we find him going to visit the Hebrew children, going to visit the slaves and see what they're doing. He had a passion in his heart. Something in him said, I wasn't born to be Pharaoh. I was born to be a child of God. Verse 11, one day after Moses was grown up, he was 40 years old according to Acts chapter 7 and Hebrews chapter 11. He went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler or judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." Oh, this is interesting because Moses is now 40 years old, probably already told Pharaoh's daughter that he didn't want to be her son any longer, and now was investigating the Hebrew children and their plight. His heart was moved. He was that Levi. He had that justice trap. He had that feeling that he had to make things right. So he sees the Hebrew being abused by an Egyptian. Now, if I were there, I think I would have defended the Hebrew, but I wouldn't have killed him. I probably would have beat the guy, and if I was strong enough, I would have beat him to a pulp, but I wouldn't have killed him. But Moses, none of that happened. It says Moses saw this. He was so incensed. He looked this way and he looked that way to see if anybody was around, and he straightforward went up and killed the Egyptian. He didn't just beat him up, didn't just send him away bruised. He killed him. It was premeditated murder, probably with a knife. We don't know how it happened, but it was premeditated because we see him looking both ways to see if anybody was around. Nobody was there, so he kills him, and then he buries him in the sand to cover up his sin. My mother had a favorite expression for us, and Moses is actually one that wrote this in Numbers chapter, I think it's chapter 32 and verse 23. "Be sure your sin will find you out." And Moses thought he had covered his sin, but he probably forgot that this Hebrew knew what was going on, and other people probably saw it too. So the next day he goes out, he's doing the same thing, and he's trying to divide two brothers that were fighting with each other. And they said, "Who made you ruler? Who made you Pharaoh over us?" And then he realized when the man said, "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And so Moses went back to Pharaoh's household and found out that Pharaoh heard about it as well. And Pharaoh was out to kill him. And so we know that Moses at this time leaves Pharaoh's household. I would love to know the details behind the scene. When he goes back to Pharaoh and goes back to the household, what happens? And the speculation as he goes back, and probably there was a big rift between his stepmother, who was the Pharaoh, and the contesting Pharaoh, her stepbrother, who actually was married to her, and he wanted to take power because now he was an adult. And this killer Moses just disqualified himself from being Pharaoh. And we don't know what happened to Hatshepsut, but she disappears from history at the same time that Moses disappears from Egypt. Perhaps that's the time at which the power switched and her brother took power. Maybe she was poisoned, or maybe she was put to death. We don't know. But Moses flees, and the next section tells us where he went.